Chris Naismith, the Principal of Methodist College, and I'd just like to, first of all, extend a very, very warm welcome to each and every one of you this morning. It's fantastic that we're able to come together here in order to hear some leading experts in the field of academic study and politics from Northern Ireland and throughout the United Kingdom as well. I hope that you get a huge amount out of today. But before we begin, there are sort of two things I need to do. The first one is the safety briefing. In the event that the fire alarm goes off and there's an emergency evacuation, the emergency exits from the Whitmore Hall are located at the sides there and also at the back through the door which you entered. If you follow a Methodist College pupil, when you go out of here, you go across the quad and then you head down towards the railings and you'll see the school assembling down there. But we don't have any fire alarms or anything planned for this morning, so hopefully it will run without incident. The other thing I'd like to do is say a huge thank you to the University of Ulster and the Politics Association, Politics Studies Association for co-sponsoring this conference today. A lot of work is required in order to set it all up, and I'd like to thank them for what you have done in making this happen. I'd also like to welcome and thank our speakers from Nottingham, Trent, Exeter and the Open University. Again, the fact that they've given up their time to travel here today and share their expertise with us is very, very much appreciated. And finally, on a personal level, I'd like to thank my own Head of Politics, John Foster, who in a very, very busy schedule in and out of the classroom has also dedicated a huge amount of time and effort into making today happen. So I hope you find it useful and productive and most of all enjoyable and stimulating. I hand you over to Mr. Foster. Thank you.
I'm just going to briefly say a few things. Just one thing in addition to what the Master said. For those of you who met today, you're very welcome. If you do need to use the toilets, outside of the corridors, the right-hand side, gents, and on the left-hand side of the ladies. Am I correct? Yeah, okay, thank you, Alan. Okay. Now, as the headmaster was saying, this conference came about, and I hope it's of use to you, because I think sitting down in a few months' time in May, many of you will be sitting down doing a comparative paper, and I've realised over a number of years teaching that opportunities to meet with people who are expert in comparative politics and on the American Constitution have been fairly limited. So we brought them to Belfast today to share with you their ideas and their thinking. And we also would like you, obviously, after they've spoken, to ask as many questions that are on your mind, something you've maybe been doing in an essay, something you have an unresolved issue with some matter, some aspect of comparative politics. So please do take the opportunity to ask questions. The conference will be videoed, so there will be an opportunity to access what you've heard today at another time, at your own leisure, and that will be on the Political Studies Association website. And on that subject, I'm going to ask Cathy Gorman-Heenan, Dr. Cathy Gorman-Heenan from the University of Ulster, to come forward and say a little bit word about today's conference and something a little bit special about it as well. Okay.
Hello everyone, you're very welcome. I'm delighted to be able to be here today to represent the Political Studies Association. This is the first time that we've held a student-teacher outreach event like this, and if it goes well today, we'll catch up with you all afterwards in the break. If it goes well today, we'll try to run something like this every year and rotate it around some of the different schools, so any feedback will be very welcome from you. Now, part of today's event, we organised a student competition, and we had a lot of entries to that. So we have picked a number of winners, and we are asking the winners to introduce our guest speakers all throughout the morning. So we'll stagger the announcements of who has won which prize. But the first, I'll drop my bit of paper with the prize winners on it. The prize winners for the essay on Constitution went to Fraser Wallace from the MCB, from memory, and Jamie Woods from Sullivan and Bartlett, with no notes, I know. So congratulations to both Fraser and Jamie, and a word of caution, don't ask for their essays afterwards and think that you can repeat that in the exam that come May or June, because what university professors and lecturers look for in an essay is not necessarily what's on the A-level curriculum and that kind of tick by number, the key things that you need to get into your essay. We're looking for different things, and all of the prize winners today had a certain edge to their essays that may be picked up by your examiners in your exams in May and June, but will certainly be picked up if you decide to pick politics as an option at university. So congratulations to everybody today. And I just want to finish by saying at the University of Ulster we have begun to work very closely with Parliament now, and one part of this is the US, the other part being the UK, but we've started working closely with Parliament on parliamentary studies and looking at how legislation is made in Parliament and so on, and we have a new module that has been validated and is taught in partnership with the House of Commons and the House of Lords, so we have people come over each alternative weeks to teach the students on our programmes, and the students then go out to the House of Commons and House of Lords as well. So we have some information on that in your packs too, and you can speak to anybody from the University of Ulster about that on the break. So without further ado, I'd like to call up both Fraser and Jamie to accept their awards.
Hi there everyone, you're all very welcome here to Methley today. My name is Fraser, people here on TV, and I answered the question on the Constitution being no longer fit for purpose. One of the main flaws that I had in my essay was that the Constitution of the Patriot Act, the ability to protect individual liberties as arisen in post 9/11 America, and especially initiatives such as the Patriot Act. For many groups such as the Concerned Citizens Against the Patriot Act, the issue of due process, as articulated in the Bill of Rights, seems to be fronted. The dilemma is one of society trying to protect its ordinary citizens against direct attacks, however, by using methods which seem to undermine the checks and balances which are fundamental to the Constitution.
Hi everyone, I'm Jamie. One of the key arguments that I put in my essay was that the judiciary in America has become politicised. So if we take the Supreme Court, for example, when a vacancy arises, it's the President who chooses the new member. So under that system, the President is obviously going to choose somebody who is sympathetic to his views. So when the position of Chief Justice arose in 2005, George Bush made sure that he picked a Republican in John Roberts to fill the space. By appointing a member of the court, the President can shape important judicial decisions for years to come, well beyond his presidency. This has prompted judges to be described as politicians in robes. This assessment, however, can be unfair because some judges have gone against their supposed ideology. For example, Sandra Day O'Connor, a Republican justice, voted in favour of an abortion law, which obviously you wouldn't expect. It is therefore unfair to say that judges are in any way like politicians because they are relatively independent in nature and always willing to go against their supposed ideology.
And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Matthew Ashton from Northern Trent University. Dr. Ashton currently writes witty blogs on his website surrounding issues to do with American and British politics.
Can you all hear me without the mic, or? No? Okay, right. Oh, no, hello? Can you hear me now? Awesome. You know, I've just suddenly realised in a room of, I don't know, about 100 plus people, I'm the only person here not wearing a tie. My mother would be ashamed if she ever sees this. Just trying. Okay, yeah, I'm Dr. Matthew Ashton, lecturer in politics at Nottingham Trent University. This is not the very start. Okay, good. Hopefully that will stay on now. And thank you very much for inviting me here today. I really do appreciate it. If I weren't here, I'd be in a 3-hour standards and quality meeting. So this is by far the better option. And I think what Kathy was saying about being very careful about what you write for your A-level paper in terms of the marking criteria is really, really important. Mainly because 2 years ago, I was concerned that we had more and more students entering the university who had done politics A-level. And when I was a student, I hadn't done politics A-level because it just simply wasn't available. And loads of my colleagues hadn't either. So I thought, okay, I'll give this a go. I'll go along, I'll find an adult education college, I'll do it in the evening, how hard can it be? And I sat down and I did the A-level paper, and I got a B. And I'm still bitter about this. I took it on to a friend of mine who marks A-level papers, and I said, where did I go wrong? And he read it, and he looked at me, and he said, basically you were trying to be too clever by half. For the stuff about parties, you don't need to talk about Timorous versus Twin City area new parties, or go into the details of what's wrong with difference of law, stuff like that. So do bear that in mind, stick to the marking criteria whenever possible. Don't try and go over the top there. Anyway, I should just put this up. Can you all see that okay? Awesome. I do like to ask questions as I go along, by the way. And if you could give me some sort of feedback there, that would be great. Because if I ask questions and no one says anything, and you're just staring at me, it really begins to freak me out after a while. So, some kind of response would be good. Also, do please put some thought into the answers. I did this talk a while ago, or a different talk at a school, and it's about crime in America, and why crime in America fell in the mid-1990s. So I was saying to the students, about 1995, crime fell in America, all types of crime, all demographics. Why do you think this was? And the student right at the back put up her hand, and I said yes. And she said, was it something to do with 9/11? And I said, you've got to stop buying those cheap calendars, it's a false economy. Well, the worst one ever was when I was talking to some students and I was asking them who controlled the media in America, and the guy at the back, he was at the back for some reason, put up his hand, and I said yes, and he said the Jews, and I was like, oh. And then I spent half an hour explaining that one, so anyway. Yeah, the Constitution in America, whether it's still fit for purpose. But am I too loud, or? Okay, up here it sounds like I'm really, really loud. It's a tricky one, it really is, because it depends on your perspective quite a lot. I mean, the earlier student, whose name I forget, he was saying about the judiciary having become politicised. Some people would argue it was always politicised. If you look at, for instance, the trial of Aaron Burr, anyone know who Aaron Burr was? Former Vice President of the USA, who actually killed Alexander Hamilton, one of the founding fathers of the USA. Don't worry about it, just leave it. And he was put on trial before the Supreme Court, and Jefferson was the president, and he was determined that Aaron Burr was going to, be locked up and he was going to be found guilty. However, the Supreme Court justice at the time was a guy called Marshall, who was actually Jefferson's distant cousin and hated his guts with a passion. And this is around the time the Federalist Party and the Anti-Federalist Party were fighting it out. So I'd argue it's always been politicised to one extent or another. It's like, have you heard of President Taft? President Taft, he's known for two things. One is the fact that he's the only president to later sit on the Supreme Court, and the other one is the fact that he weighed 300 pounds. Which is the one that you think people remember? 300 pounds, yeah, that's the one that tends to stick in the head there. So, during the course of the presentation, we'll be looking at what the original purpose of the US Constitution was. I'm going to be very careful here I don't fall off. How the purpose has changed over time, and how well does the Constitution still perform its role. And again, I think a large part of it is depending on your perspective here. Can you all see that okay? 71% of Americans, when asked about this recently, actually said that if the founding fathers could see America today, you know, they'd be disappointed, you know. But that has to be put in the context that only 94% of Americans can't name more than 5 signers of the Declaration of Independence. And in some cases, some of them can't even spell the word Constitution. I love that photo. It's, there's another one, I couldn't find it, where a guy's waving his sign saying, you know, Obama, you're a moron, and he spells moron with an A. And there does seem to be an issue here where there is a decline in faith in the American system. You know, recently, again, Americans were asked in a poll, 59% of Americans thought that America was still, you know, the land of opportunity, the American dream. But that is significantly down from where it was in the 1950s and the 1960s. Events like Watergate, events like the Vietnam War, Iran-Contra, Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky, have, you know, deflated people's expectations of government. But, you know, that said, the Constitution itself, hopefully you've all read it now several times over, and I read it, you know, all the time, for the module that I teach, and the one thing that keeps sort of hitting me over and over again whenever I read it is what a brilliantly written document it is. Okay, I think it's really well worded, it's readable, it's concise. So this is essentially a guideline or guidebook for running a country that's absolutely huge, of 300 million people, and yet it's still shorter than the man of my DVD player. I checked it out last night and it is. Also it's more readable than my DVD player kind of. And again, some would say that the success or failure of the Constitution is reflected in America's world role today. For a long time, people were saying, yeah, the Constitution's still doing a great job. America, you know, for a long period now, the world's superpower. However, questions are now being raised because America is seemingly in decline. And there's a big debate going on about whether that decline is permanent or whether they can actually do something about it, whether China's going to implode or what's going to happen with Russia, so on and so forth. I mean, certainly the fact that you've got things like Detroit, you all hear about this last year? Yeah, the motor city becoming bankrupt, unthinkable only a few decades before. However, you could also argue that the Constitution has created a political system thanks to the guarantee of rights, thanks to the freedom of speech, thanks to the freedom of association, where you have this huge multicultural society. You know, it's the land of immigrants, all of these people from all of these different places. By the way, don't feel you have to write any of this down. I've written this up. It's not in your packs, but I'm going to email it out to someone, Kathy, I believe, who will email it out to everybody, so don't feel you have to write any of this stuff down. Yeah, it's the land of immigrants, and by and large, they get along, by and large. It's compared to a lot of places in the world with high levels of immigration like this, with high levels of different social cleavages, be they religious, ethnic, economic, you know, people who are fighting each other to the death. In America, they tend to get along, which isn't to say there aren't huge problems there. The fact that, you know, if you're an African American, you're more likely to go to prison than to college is a long-standing problem. And then obviously they've tried various solutions to that, stuff like affirmative action, and there's a big debate there about whether small amounts of discrimination now is worth it to sort of solve longer periods of discrimination in the future. I think that's a debatable one. But certainly, this is a really good example of the Constitution coming into play. Because originally they tried affirmative action on the basis of quotas, saying we're going to put aside a certain amount of places at a university or whatnot for African American students. And this was challenged, I think the case was back versus the Regents of the University of California. And the Supreme Court said this is unconstitutional, you can't do this. However, you can take race into consideration when letting people into the university because we believe diversity is a First Amendment interest. And obviously that depends very much on the reading of the Constitution. So you could also point out the fact that America and the Constitution has produced this kind of laissez-faire, anything-goes economic system of gross capitalism. You know, Theodor Adorno talking about the culture industry, where the entire model is based on constant consumption. Hence the reason why some of them are so fat. Maybe they eat stuff like that for breakfast. And even worse, they force poor Europeans to eat that stuff for breakfast when they're there. That was in Las Vegas, and I couldn't help myself. I really couldn't. That's probably the best, because at some point I will fall off and, you know, I don't want to break anything too expensive. By the way, when I'm talking at OK speed, when I get excited, I tend to talk quicker and quicker and quicker. So if at any point I'm not making myself clear, please do put up your hand, let me know, okay, and that'd be fantastic. So, what was the original purpose of the US Constitution? The obvious answer obviously is to replace the Articles of Confederation. You've all read about those? See, this is that thing where you're trying to nod, but while moving your head as little as humanly possible. It's just a quick show of hands. You're all familiar with this stuff? Some of you not so much. I mean, the Articles of Confederation is the system of government they had after the Revolutionary War. And again, the one thing they were absolutely terrified by is the idea of tyranny. The idea that we've replaced one dictator, tyrant George III, and we're going to have another one. And it's very much based on the idea of states' rights. You know, to amend it, you know, every state had the agreement. Nothing was getting done. The post wasn't being delivered. But yeah, if you can say to the founding fathers, what is the purpose behind the Constitution? A good place to look is the preamble. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defence, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish the Constitution for the United States of America. Now, first off, what's really obviously problematic about that? Anyone? Anyone take a guess? Absolutely, yeah. Every single word on there pretty much is open to interpretation. I mean, liberty, you've already got the question there about, are you talking about, you know, positive or negative liberty? Freedom from something, freedom to do something. And Americans have got a very differing idea of this compared to the European model. The whole thing about the general welfare, I mean, certainly they weren't talking about African Americans here. If you actually look at the Constitution and read through it, it doesn't mention African Americans. The entire Constitution always refers to other persons. These actually refer to the Native Americans as well. Perfect union, established justice, again, justice for who, that is open to debate. And the thing is, people talk about the wisdom of the founding fathers. Jefferson, who wasn't actually at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787, he was busy off being ambassador to Paris. I mean, John Adams wasn't there either, he was in London. He called the founding fathers a collection of demigods. And I think the word I use is liars, swindlers, thieves and cheats, and in some cases sociopaths. I mean, in the case of Thomas Jefferson, a rapist, what Sally Hemings read about it, it's dreadful. That will probably get cut. Although that's it, you can't lie on the dead. It's, I hope. Yeah, and if you actually look at the people who turned up in Philadelphia, I mean, Rhode Island didn't send anyone. I mean, we talk about the founding fathers, but there's lots of debate about who the founding fathers were. Was it people who were involved in the early government, people who were at Philadelphia, people who were involved in the Revolutionary War? I mean, again, Aaron Burr is often not counted as a founding father, even though he was the vice president very early on and he fought in the Revolutionary War. The thing you have to remember about the founding fathers is they themselves disputed these terms all the way through the time they were writing the Constitution, ratifying the amendments that would become the Bill of Rights. There was a big disagreement about what this actually meant and what form of government would suit them best. So, you know, you've got people like Jefferson and John Adams, who eventually fell out, and I think they spoke for about 22 years. You've got Madison and Hamilton, who together wrote the Federalist Papers to try and persuade people to ratify the Constitution. Are you familiar with the Federalist Papers? Have you read it at all? Normally people just read numbers 10 and 51. They're usually the go-to papers. They end up disagreeing an awful lot. And the other thing you have to remember about the founding fathers is a lot of the time they lied about stuff. They say one thing and do another. I mean, Jefferson was always banging on about the evils of slavery, and yet he never freed his slaves. Whatever else you may say about George Washington, eventually he did, although even though he waited until he died till he did that. Equally, if you look at Alexander Hamilton, in some of his writings he talks about the evils of borrowing money. And he talks about, and there's a letter to Robert Morris, who was the guy who funded the revolution or raised money for it, and he talks about the evils of the national debt. Here, though, he said, national debt, if it is not excessive, will be to us a national blessing. Just out of interest, does anyone know what the national debt of America currently is? Give or take, you can't really see that very well in this slide, about 14 trillion. Which I suspect is bigger than Alexander Hamilton actually intended. I could be wrong about that. But it's going up all the time. There's a great website where you can literally see it, Whenever I get a bit depressed about my credit card bill, I had a look at it and I just feel better. It's, you could argue the more money you earn, the more successful you are. Maybe. And again, they finally disagree. If you look at Benjamin Franklin, there's a story, possibly made up, about when he came out of the Constitutional Convention Hall in Philadelphia. And they'd been holding these meetings in secret because they didn't want the general populace to know what they were doing, because they wanted to be able to change their minds. And this led to an awful lot of suspicion on various people's minds about, actually, they're going to create this kind of elite. So the Knights of Cincinnati that Washington was a member of, him and Henry Knox, they're going to create this elite and they're going to rule in the country. It's going to be King George IV, with George Washington in charge. And this old woman came up to Benjamin Franklin and said, so what's it going to be, Doctor? Are we going to have a republic or a democracy? And he said, a republic, madam, if you can keep it. And he certainly didn't think they were creating a democracy, at least not in the terms that we would understand it today. Whereupon Alexander Hamilton, to a certain degree, John Adams, was certainly more of an elitist in that respect. There's a great quote here from Benjamin Franklin about John Adams, where he said, he means well for his country, is always an honest man, often a wise one, but sometimes, and in some things, absolutely out of his mind. So again, they disagreed all the time. So when people say this is what the founding fathers meant, that's already problematic because some of them meant one thing, some of them meant something else, and that changed significantly over time. Okay? And there's a whole thing here about judicial intent. Okay, when they look back on the founding fathers of the Supreme Court and said, we're going to try and figure out what the founding fathers meant by this. And that is very political. It's fraught with difficulties of all sorts. And that's one of the big problems of the Constitution. They didn't give an awful lot of guidance there. But, again, I'd argue, when people talk about the fact that, the Constitution as if it's set in stone, as if it's this sort of perfect work, again, the founding fathers knew that it wasn't. I mean, again, some bits, especially the bit on the court system, incredibly vague. Again, open to interpretation, stuff like high crimes and misdemeanours if you're trying to impeach someone. Obviously, later on, the whole thing about the right to bear arms. If you're looking about cruel and unusual punishments, all of those things are open to the widest interpretation imaginable. I mean, personally, I'd argue that running electricity through someone for 20 minutes until they die is a cruel and unusual punishment. Americans take a slightly different view with me on this, although my girlfriend, who's French, she's always banging on about the joys of the guillotine, so. I'm hoping she's joking, I couldn't really tell though. So the US Constitution, if you're looking at it today, okay, so broadly, what is the purposes of it? What kind of stuff will people say? This is where hopefully we're going to get dangerously interactive. Any ideas what's happening there? Yeah, to protect the rights of the American people, to protect their civil liberties. Absolutely, bang on, I agree with that. What else? Yes? I'm sorry? Absolutely, yeah, to protect people from the government. I think it was Ronald Reagan who said the most frightening phrase you can hear is, hello, I'm from the government, I'm here to help. He also said, big government is the problem, not the solution. Although that said, government increased massively under his time in office. Reaganomics never really worked, it's a bad idea. Yeah, Americans do have this really weird suspicion of their government, although considering the latest revelations about the NSA, possibly not unfounded. Anything else? Yes? Yeah, it's good to have these rights written down where you can see them, as opposed to the British, in unwritten constitution, where lots of it is archaic or, in some cases, meaningless now, and bits overlap. The American system is much more concise, although again, open to interpretation. I mean, I'd argue four of the main roles. There are other purposes behind it, okay, but, I'd need an entire day year to really go into this. Is provide stability. Again, one of the things that we were really worried about back in 1787 is the idea of the country falling apart, the states breaking off from each other, invasion again by the British, or maybe even the French, or the Spanish in Florida. Although the British did finally, we had our revenge, I think 1812, we went back and burned down the White House. Prevent tyranny, have you seen all this stuff? Have you seen the birth movement? There are all the crazy people in America who believe that Barack Obama is secretly a Muslim. Have you heard anything about these guys? Part of the Tea Party. And they've got this weird idea saying, he was raised by Muslims to become president of the United States of America. And I always think the biggest problem with this as an idea is if you're in the 1960s and you think, okay, we're going to get a kid, and we're going to raise this kid to become president of the United States of America, you probably wouldn't pick an African-American kid with the name Barack Hussein Obama. In 1962, I wouldn't have bet my money on that, but that's the thing with conspiracy theorists. The more you logically argue with them, the less they'll, believe you. Protect rights, as someone said, absolutely. And create some form of representative government. And again, their idea of what is deemed a representative government is very different from what we think of. I mean, certainly, again, they didn't like the idea of political parties, even though they evolved quite quickly. George Washington, in his farewell speech to the nation, warned the country against the malignant spirit of faction, as he referred to it. So, this idea of tyranny. The American humorist P.J. O'Rourke once said that giving money and power to government is like giving whiskey and car keys to teenage boys. Bad idea, not to be recommended. And they did fear the idea of too much power being concentrated in one set of hands. And it's kind of weird though when you think about it, because they said we don't want any one person to become too powerful, and yet we're going to make this one person commander-in-chief of the armed forces, which when you think about it is a huge power. One of the only reasons they did this is because they were almost 100% certain at the time is that George Washington was going to be the first president. And he's someone who had been a commander-in-chief of the armed forces, and that they knew that he wasn't going to do anything silly. He'd had the opportunity before to kind of set himself up as king, and he hadn't. One of the few people where, the old maxim, power tends to corrupt, absolute power corrupts absolutely. That seemed not to apply to George Washington. But certainly today there's an argument that the Constitution's failed, because we've seen the rise of the imperial presidency. Certainly the founding fathers intended, or arguably intended, Congress to be the most powerful body, of the three branches of government. Hence, in fact, it's the one that makes the laws. It's the one that comes first in the Constitution. However, ever since the 1930s, with Franklin D. Roosevelt and the New Deal, you've seen this growing power on the part of the presidency. And there's a lot of reasons for this. Partly the failure of Congress, partly America's growing world role, partly the growth of the federal bureaucracy, partly the fact that America has been presidents always tend to be stronger during a crisis. In America, from the 30s onwards, you had the Great Depression, you had World War II, you had the Korean War, so on and so forth, the Cold War. They succeeded an awful lot of power, but also in the power to make laws. Again, it's now it's up to the president to put forward a bunch of ideas, and maybe we'll turn them into laws, maybe we won't. And even if they're not going to pass the law the president wants, how do presidents normally get around it these days? What do they use instead? which is constitutionally something that I think is still a bit up in the air. Yes. Absolutely, yeah, executive orders. They pass these all the time now. And again, if you look on the graphs, the numbers since the 30s onwards has increased massively. There's also the whole issue about, are you familiar with the whole idea of signing statements? When they sign bills into law now, assuming they haven't used a veto or pocket veto, they write stuff in the margins that has an impact in terms of how the federal bureaucracy is going to implement this law, and that actually has a certain amount of legal weight. But again, some of that stuff is disputed by certain constitutional scholars. But there's no doubt, really, I'd argue the President has become far, far more powerful than the founding fathers of the Constitution ever intended. And this has led to an unbalancing of the US government. And partly, you could argue, has led to this kind of polarised politics that we have at the moment, this kind of unpleasant partisanship. In terms of the idea of stability and how stable the US government is, the whole idea of the separation of powers and the checks and balances. And again, the whole idea of the separation of powers, to a certain extent, was never really there in the first place. You know, you say, oh, it's completely separated. It's not. You've got stuff like the Vice President acting as a tiebreaker in the Senate, casting votes. You've got the fact that the President appoints the judiciary. You've got the fact that the President can pardon anyone for anything. The fact that the President can theoretically make laws. The fact that it's the Senate that decides whether you can go to war or not. It's obviously a big component of foreign policy. So again, it's never really separated, but there has been this increasing blurring and reinterpretation. And some people would argue, again, the checks and balances don't work. Congress has been spectacularly bad at restraining the powers of the presidency for a long time. And that's what led to stuff like the Vietnam War. I mean, just out of interest, how many times has America actually declared war in its history? Oh, well, yeah, 5. Can you name the wars? Fair enough, fair enough. It's War of 1812, the Mexican War, the Spanish War, World War I, World War II. The entire Vietnam War was done on the basis of something called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, giving the President all powers necessary to bring this emergency to a close. And after the whole, Richard Nixon debacle, they kind of looked into this and they passed something called the War Powers Act to try and strengthen their ability to stop presidents using the army in any way they see fit. But again, I'd argue that recent history suggests that the War Powers Act hasn't really worked at all. Again, complete failure on the part of Congress to actually control the presidency in any meaningful way. And the power of investigation, the fact that so many people in Congress seem to have no idea what the federal bureaucracy was up to, it's slightly worrying. Some would argue that the checks and balances work too well. The fact that we have a system of political gridlock where nothing is getting done. And, healthcare, for instance. There was a demand on the part of the American people for healthcare reform going back to the 1950s. I mean, Franklin D. Roosevelt was talking about it, Truman talked about it, Roosevelt talked about it. Bill Clinton had a go at doing it in the 1990s. Absolutely nothing happened. Partly due to the Iron Triangle, which we'll come on to in a second. You all know what the Iron Triangle is? Iron Triangle? Gordon Adams? No, okay, come on to that in a second. So they've argued, too much gridlock, nothing is getting done. And again, if you're a founding fathers fan, you say, well, again, this is what they intended. The government that governs best governs least. You don't want the government doing lots of stuff. That will lead to, them passing terrible laws all the time. We want them to become gridlocked. But again, we saw it led to terrible things like fighting in the streets. The shutdown of the federal government recently, again back in mid-1990s. This whole idea of government of the people, by the people, for the people. Some people would say, well, actually, no. The fact the Supreme Court has argued that free speech, the First Amendment right to free speech means you can spend as much money as you like on elections, has led to these bloated election campaigns. And I think the last one collectively came to $6 billion. A staggeringly large amount of money. And as a result of that, the people with the most money get the loudest voice. And the entire system has become unbalanced in favour of the super rich. And the Iron Triangle is this idea that essentially there's this sort of nasty, it's to explain policy outcomes, the idea that you've got on one hand Congress, on the other hand the federal bureaucracy, on the other hand interest groups, big business, and they combine together into this policy triangle to make sure that they get the policies that suit them. There's a great article in the Washington Post recently saying that the US military keeps saying to Congress, stop buying us tanks. We don't need tanks. Tanks are not the military weapon of the future. We want drones. However, the tank industry in America is very, very powerful, has a lot of lobbyists, has a lot of friends in Congress, and are pumping all of this money in to make sure that Congress keeps putting in orders for more tanks, even though they're not needed. And that's to explain the fact that military spending, up until quite recently, has just been rising and rising and rising for the most part. Certainly there was a big peace dividend that everyone thought was going to rise after the end of the Cold War in 1990. Military spending in America is horrific, I think. And some people say that America is now a kind of oligarchy, ruled by billionaires. Just for the record, I don't think those are real billionaires, but it's the only photo I could find when I looked on Google Images. And these kind of sort of political families, the Rockefellers, the Clintons, the Bushes, it's the, America is no longer a pluralist democracy, the sort of stuff that Robert Dahl was talking about. It's much more the idea of the writer in the 1950s, like C. Wright Mills, who talks about the power of the elite. And you could argue the Constitution has created a system where certain people get to the top of the tree and then never leave. And if you're a sort of conspiracy theorist, you think that this is the Bilderberg Group, or the Trilateral Commission, or if you're David, have you heard of David Icke? He believes that we're ruled secretly by giant lizards. Have you heard of this? It's crazy talk. And this in turn has led to huge disparities in wealth and income across the United States. It's a fundamentally incredibly unfair system. But again, you could argue that was never the purpose of the Constitution. The founding fathers were not interested in the slightest inequality of outcome. They were more interested in the idea of equality of opportunity. As Randy Newman once said, life isn't fair. Never has been, never will be. The trick is to make it unfair to your advantage. So in terms of rights, again, how good is the Constitution and the system of government set up in defending rights? I'd argue really bad. Because, 1791, you've got the Bill of Rights. Again, this idea saying you have freedom of speech, you have the freedom to own a gun or an arm or whatnot, all of this other stuff. And yet, just a few years later, under John Adams, you got the Alien Sedition Acts. They were so worried about the idea of war with France that he was going around having his political enemies locked up. He was having newspaper editors and journalists locked up. He was having newspapers closed down, purely because he was so paranoid about the anti-federalists and the idea of war with France. He was having people deported. Huge bits of the Constitution were just being ignored, and no one was really doing anything about it. It's a little bit like, have you ever heard of anything called the Slaughterhouse Case? I don't know if you heard of the Slaughterhouse Case. It happened about 6 years after the 14th Amendment had been passed, and essentially invalidated most of the entire 14th Amendment. And again, it's only after that they looked at it. So you've got stuff like the Alien Sedition Acts, Japanese Americans being locked up during World War II and being interned. The Supreme Court wasn't doing much about that. Then simply the fact that so much of the Constitution is open to this interpretation. So when the founding fathers were talking about the right to bear arms, their idea of an arm was a musket, where if you were really good, maybe you could fire it about once a minute. Okay? If you'd said to them an arm in the future was going to be something like that, or that, they probably, I don't know, maybe they'd rethought it, I don't know. When I was in Las Vegas, we went to a gun range just to try it out, because I'd never shot a gun before, and they had this machine gun. I was having a go at it, and the guy was explaining it to me. He was saying, this gun here, it shoots, 60 bullets every 20 seconds. And I was like, wow. And he was like, I know what you're thinking. And I was like, yeah. And he said, it's not enough. I was like, no, that wasn't what I was thinking after all, actually. So the whole idea of what an arm is, again, the whole thing people forget about, the right to bear arms as part of a well-ordered militia and whatnot. And again, that's open to dispute. And gun control is obviously a very politicised issue. The National Rifle Association, all of those kind of people, it is open to interpretation. But equally, the idea of freedom of expression. You know, Thomas Jefferson, very fond of the idea of this. You know, he spoke about the idea that, he said, if I were to have government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I would prefer the latter. Although that's before he actually became president and had 8 years of people writing about his private life. And then he was suddenly a little less enthusiastic about the idea of the free press. But again, obviously there are limits to the right of free speech, and they are defined by the Supreme Court. I can't remember the Justice who said it. He said, the freedom of speech is not the freedom to yell fire in a crowded theatre. You know, fighting words on covered by freedom of speech. Stuff like obscenity is all down to interpretation. But, you know, you've got this great freedom of association where on the one hand, you can go and protest about stuff all the time. That's over gay marriage. But equally, you know, the founding fathers, I don't think would have ever imagined. If you remember the Phelps family, they're the dreadful, dreadful people who turn up at the funeral of dead soldiers and protest the funerals. And the Supreme Court a while ago ruled that it was constitutional, that they were allowed to do that because it was protected under their right of free speech. Equally, the Supreme Court, in my mind, hasn't done enough to say, limit the right of huge corporations from doing whatever they want. You know, most of America, in terms of media, is dominated by big corporations. At which point you could argue that the right to free speech is really the right of 4 or 5 very, very rich men to do and say whatever they like. Rupert Murdoch, for instance. Equally, the founding fathers never saw the internet coming. And again, I suspect they wouldn't have approved. You know, I've seen what's on the internet and I don't like it. And I'm sure if they'd seen Fox News, God knows what they would have thought about that. There's Dick Morrison, who used to work for Bill Clinton, saying there's going to be a Romney landslide. In fact, my favourite thing from Fox News is when I was in America. Do you remember 7/7? Yeah? I just got off the plane, it was 7/7, I arrived at the hotel, I sat down, I was jet lagged, I turned on the TV, and there was this sort of scene of carnage on the street, and the Fox News guy, I had no idea what was going on, but the Fox News guy was reading it out, and he was saying, terrorist attack in a major European city. Find out which one after the advert break. And I thought, that's not good journalism. Equally, the right to privacy. There's a big debate there about whether the right to privacy is actually guaranteed by the Constitution or not. If you look at people like Robert Bork, who Ronald Reagan wanted to put on the Supreme Court, and the Democrats wouldn't let him be on there because Robert Bork was Richard Nixon's hatchet man back in the day. He said there is no guaranteed right of privacy under the Constitution. Hence you've got stuff like the NSA doing whatever it wants and spying on people. And I'd argue again the Constitution has done a spectacularly poor job of protecting people from their own government in that respect. In terms of the idea of representative government and voting, again the founding fathers did not envisage the more secular democracy that we have today. Hopefully remember set up. And there's still the problem, the fact that certain parts of America aren't really a democracy. For instance, I've got friends who live in Washington, D.C., which, you know, as the name suggests, isn't a state, it's a district. And they didn't get electoral college votes until 1961. They still don't properly get representation in the US Congress, and certainly not in the Senate. So they're saying, you know, it's on the button place, you know, we are being taxed by the US government, and yet we are not being represented in terms of laws being made. And they're saying this is fundamentally undemocratic, and the Constitution doesn't cover that properly. Equally, I love that guy. I like him more now he's no longer president. The fact that you have an electoral college system where you can actually win the presidency while not winning the popular vote, I'd argue is very popular. If it had been a popular vote system, you'd have Al Gore in charge. Is that really representing the will of the people? The fact that these huge disparities here in terms of the Great Compromise, You know, because when they was writing the Constitution, all of the smaller states said, we want a system where everyone gets one vote, regardless of how big or small the states are. The bigger states, like Virginia, said, no, that's a terrible idea. We want the number of representatives compared to the size of our population. And hence they compromised. You've got the House of Representatives, which is more proportional, and then you've got the Senate. And the trouble is, then, you've got states like Rhode Island, which is where Family Guy sits, which has got a population of 1.5 million people. And then you've got California, 38 million people. And you've got 2 senators per state, regardless of population. Some people would argue that's not particularly democratic, it's not particularly representative. And again, if you look at, this is the US map distorted in terms of population sizes. Some places very small populations, other places much bigger populations. And this is one of the issues with amending the Constitution, which I'll come to in a second. In fact, right now, because it's so difficult to amend the Constitution, there are advantages to this, but some would say that it gives the dead a vote. Because how many states do you need in order to amend the Constitution? 38. Yeah, you need 3/4 of them. But it doesn't say anything in particular about the size of the states in terms of population. So theoretically, you could have all of the smaller states. And the fact that back in the day, you only needed a handful of states to amend the Constitution. So back in 1791, when they created the Bill of Rights, a very, very small number of people actually amended this, added it to the Constitution, and now today, you need 200 million odd people in order to get it out of the Constitution. Which seems like a really crazy system when you think about it. Is that going to make sense? Again, you're doing that thing where you're nodding with your head as little as humanly possible. I'll take it as read, so I'm running out of time a little bit here. And again, certain constitutional amendments you could argue have been a very, very good idea. For instance, I'm a huge fan of the 22nd Amendment saying that you can only run for president twice. Although, again, people who wanted Clinton to run again or Reagan to run again wouldn't think it's a good idea. And some people have argued that, again, you know, it's limiting the democratic will of the people. Every year, normally, Congress tries to get something started. Normally it's a symbolic gesture, saying that we want the right to, with a congressional amendment, to stop people burning the flag. There's been a court case about this in the early 1990s, and the Supreme Court said, look, we're not particularly happy with the idea of burning the flag, but you have the right to do so if you wish. And it's covered under the freedom of speech laws. But, you know, certainly the fact that I think it's good that you can't add amendments that easily, because if you look at the number of crazy amendments they tried to add over the years, 1912, someone put forward an amendment to ban interracial marriage. Back in the 19th century, someone put forward an amendment they wanted to rename the United States the United States of Earth. Someone wanted to put forward an amendment declaring that Jesus Christ was the unique and only protector of the United States. Crazy stuff. 1933, in the aftermath of the Great Depression, someone wanted to put forward a constitutional amendment that would limit personal wealth to $1 million. Although again, a lot of this stuff in the 1930s didn't lead people to rethink the Constitution. Have you heard of a guy called Charles A. Beard? American historian, and he wrote a very influential book. It's not really reading these days, but he wrote a very influential book back in the day called An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution. And he said, actually, the whole purpose of the Constitution, you know, it wasn't anything about stable government or the rights of the people or anything like that. It was the fact that the founding fathers did it to benefit themselves because they all had huge amounts of debt left over from the Revolutionary War, and therefore they needed a national government in order to bail themselves out, basically. They did it out of financial self-interest. However, someone again redid the figures in the 1950s, and that doesn't stand up to scrutiny. There's some people still buy into that argument. And then again, some amendments have been a mistake. For instance, the 18th Amendment saying that you're not allowed to drink, trying to ban alcohol, which went down as pretty much as well as we could have expected. And they repealed that a few years debate because, you know, the Great Depression was fairly horrific and everyone said, you know, we're all out of work, we're all unemployed, you know, things are pretty terrible, let's get drunk. Because when does that never solve people's problems, you know? Although, no. And then you've got the Supreme Court itself. And there are big problems with the Supreme Court. Again, these 9 unelected people. It's, I've got about 3-4 minutes left. Brilliant, cheers. These 9 unelected people who, you know, don't have to have any judicial experience. I mean, some of the people that they've tried to put on the Supreme Court. George W. Bush tried to put a woman called Harriet Miers, have you heard of her, on the Supreme Court? And, you know, God bless them, the Republicans, they looked at it and just said, no way, we're not, you know, even though, you know, there are presidents and all the rest of it, she's a Republican, we are not putting her on the Supreme Court. Hence the fact they got Roberts instead. And it does cause problems, the fact that the Supreme Court can interpret the law any way they like. The fact that normally courts are named after the Supreme Court justice. You've got like the Rehnquist Court, the Warren Court, the Berger Court, so on and so forth. Today, technically, it ought to be the Roberts Court, because he's the Chief Justice. Instead, a lot of people call it the Kennedy Court. Anyone know why? Anthony Kennedy? He's the swing justice. He's the one right in the middle, and depending on which way he jumps on any particular issue, he has a huge amount of influence. Just out of interest, by the way, how many people are allowed on the Supreme Court according to the Constitution? It doesn't actually specify. You can have as many people as you like, or as few people as you like, technically. This is something that Franklin D. Roosevelt tried to take advantage of with the court packing plan back in the 30s. But again, I'd argue the fact that you don't specify that does make it really problematic. And the Supreme Court made some terrible decisions. The Slaughterhouse case, Plessy versus Ferguson, you familiar with that one? You should be, probably. It's the one where they decided that it was perfectly okay to have separate facilities for white people and African Americans as long as they were equal. And it justified the Jim Crow laws of the 1890s and the early 20th century. And this separate but equal doctrine lasted all the way until the 1950s, until the Warren Court, where you had Brown versus the Board of Education, where the court said, quite rightly, you need to desegregate the schools. That slide shouldn't be there. I'm sure I probably had a reason why I had that there, but I can't think what it was. I like it though. So to recap then, is the Constitution fit for purpose? It depends. It depends whether you believe that the best form of the Constitution, if you take the founding fathers' view about what the founding fathers wanted, even though that's open to debate, if you do very well out of the current American political system, then you say, yeah, the Constitution's doing a great job. If you do very, very badly out of it, you might dispute that. It depends who you ask, and it depends which bits of the Constitution are most important to you. If you care more about stability, or if you care more about representative government, or you care more about preventing tyranny, or you care more about checks and balances. I personally would argue the fact that the Constitution has been unbalanced by money and bad Supreme Court decisions and Congress not doing their job, but, you know, that's just me. Anyway, hopefully that has not bored you to death, if nothing else. Thank you very much.